The sun hung low over the cracked, red earth of the Wyoming Territory, 1878, casting a merciless glare that turned the horizon into a shimmering mirage. Amos Tucker, a lanky cowboy of 23, squinted against the light, his hat brim sagging from years of sweat and wear. His horse, a bony mare named Clara, plodded along the trail, her hooves kicking up clouds of dust that clung to Amos's cracked lips and stung his eyes. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, chasing a rumor of work at a cattle ranch near Cheyenne. 3 days with nothing but a half-empty canteen, a strip of jerky tough as boot leather, and a gnawing hunger that felt like a fist twisting his gut. Amos had come west 5 years ago, lured by dime novels and saloon tales of adventure, freedom, and riches. Back in Ohio, he'd been a nobody, a farmhand with calloused hands and no prospects. The Wild West promised a life where a man could carve his own path, where courage and a quick draw could make you a legend. But now, slumped in the saddle, with blisters on his feet and a cough that rattled his ribs, Amos knew the truth. Being a cowboy sucked. It wasn't just hard, it was a relentless, soul-crushing grind that chewed up dreams and spit out broken men. The trail stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of dirt, cutting through sagebrush and tumbleweeds. Amos's clothes were patched and filthy, his boots so worn the soles flapped like a drunk's tongue. He'd spent his last dollar on a tin of beans a week ago, and the memory of that meal haunted him. The ranch he was headed for, owned by a man named Hargrove, was his last hope. If he didn't get hired, he'd be reduced to begging or robbing, neither of which sat right with him, though hunger was starting to blur the line between right and wrong. Cowboys were supposed to be heroes, weren't they? That's what the stories said. Men like Wild Bill Hickok or Billy the Kid, riding tall, guns blazing, living free under the wide sky. But Amos had never met a hero. The cowboys he knew were like him, desperate, dirty, and one bad day from giving up. The work was brutal. Long hours herding cattle across unforgiving land, dodging storms, rustlers, and snakes. The pay was a pittance, barely enough for a drink or a night in a flea-ridden boarding house. And the danger, it wasn't the glamorous showdowns of the novels. It was dysentery from bad water, infections from a single cut, or a spooked horse snapping your neck in a gully. As Clara trudged on, Amos thought back to his first cattle drive. 2 years ago, he'd signed on with a crew out of Texas, driving longhorns to Kansas. The trail boss, a grizzled man named McCready, had promised good wages and 3 meals a day. Lies, all of it. The food was weevil-ridden biscuits and coffee that tasted like mud. The work never stopped, dawn to dusk, sometimes through the night if the herd got restless. One night, a storm spooked the cattle, and in the chaos, a young cowboy named Tommy got trampled. They buried him in a shallow grave. No marker, no word, just another body left to the prairie. Amos shook off the memory as a vulture circled overhead, its shadow sliding across the ground like a warning. He patted Clara's neck, though she barely responded. She was as worn out as he was, her ribs showing through her dull coat. "Hang in there, girl," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or himself. The truth was, he envied the vulture. At least it ate regularly. The ranch came into view by late afternoon, a cluster of weathered buildings surrounded by corrals. Amos straightened in the saddle, trying to look like a man worth hiring. His stomach growled, and his head throbbed from dehydration, but he forced a smile as he approached the main house. A burly man with a gray mustache stepped onto the porch, eyeing Amos like he was a stray dog. "You Tucker?" the man asked, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "Yes, sir," Amos said, tipping his hat. "Heard you're looking for hands." The man, Hargrove, Amos assumed, grunted. Maybe. You look half dead. Can you rope? Ride? I can do both, Amos said, though his roping was rusty, and Clara was one stumble from collapsing. Been on drives from Texas to Montana. Hargrove squinted, unimpressed. Pays $10 a month, room in the bunkhouse, 1 meal a day. You work till I say stop. Still interested? $10. Amos's heart sank. It was barely enough to live on, let alone save for something better, but he nodded. Yes, sir. Hargrove jerked his thumb toward the bunkhouse. Settle in. We start at dawn. Amos dismounted, his legs wobbling as he led Clara to a trough. The bunkhouse was a low, sagging building that smelled of sweat and mild. Inside, a dozen men sprawled on cots, their faces gaunt, their clothes as ragged as his. One man, missing 2 fingers, coughed wetly into a rag. Another, barely older than a boy, stared at the ceiling, muttering to himself. This was the cowboy life, not glory, but survival. As Amos lay on a lumpy cot, staring at the cracked ceiling, he wondered how it had come to this. He'd left home chasing a dream, but the Wild West didn't care about dreams. It was a land of dust and desperation, where men like him were disposable. Tomorrow, he'd wake before dawn, work until his body screamed, and pray he didn't end up like Tommy, buried and forgotten. Being a cowboy wasn't an adventure, it was a trap. Amos woke to the clang of a triangle bell before dawn, the sound cutting through the Wyoming darkness like a blade. His body ached from the lumpy cot, his muscles stiff from the long ride to Hargrove's ranch. The bunkhouse was a cacophony of groans and curses as the other cowboys stirred, their breath fogging in the chilly air. Amos pulled on his boots, wincing as the worn soles pressed against his blistered feet. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours, and already the day loomed like a mountain he'd never climb. This was the cowboy life. No rest, no mercy, just work until you broke. Outside, the sky was still black, stars fading as the horizon hinted at gray. Hargrove stood by the corral, barking orders, his tobacco-stained voice grating on Amos's nerves. Tucker, you're on branding today. Don't dawdle, or you're out. Amos nodded, too tired to speak, and joined the crew trudging toward the cattle pens. The air smelled of manure and smoke, the ground slick with mud from a late-night drizzle. Clara, his mare, snorted as he saddled her, her eyes dull with the same exhaustion he felt. Branding was brutal work. The cattle, massive longhorns with horns sharp enough to gut a man, bellowed and thrashed as the cowboys wrestled them into position. Amos's job was to rope the calves, dragging them to the fire where red-hot irons waited. His hands, already calloused, blistered further as the rope bit into his palms. Each calf fought like a demon, kicking and twisting, and more than once Amos took a hoof to the shin, the pain shooting up his leg like a lightning bolt. By noon, his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold, and his arms trembled from the effort. The crew worked in grim silence, broken only by Hargrove's occasional shouts or the sizzle of flesh against iron. Amos glanced at the other men. Jake, a wiry cowboy with a limp from a bad fall last year. Eli, a kid barely 16, his face pale from hunger, and Red, a hulking man whose cough sounded like death itself. They were all breaking, piece by piece, their bodies and spirits ground down by the endless labor. Amos wondered how long he'd last before he ended up like Jake, hobbling on a leg that never healed right, or worse, like Red, coughing blood into a rag. Lunch was a brief respite. 10 minutes to choke down a tin plate of beans and a biscuit so hard it could crack teeth. The coffee was bitter, brewed from grounds used too many times, but Amos drank it anyway, hoping the warmth would trick his body into feeling alive. He sat on a crate, watching the dust swirl around the corral. Eli, the young cowboy, sat nearby, staring at his hands. This ain't what I thought it'd be, Eli muttered, his voice barely audible. Amos wanted to say something encouraging, but the words wouldn't come. What was there to say? The kid was right. Back to work. The afternoon brought fence mending, a task no less punishing than branding. Amos and Jake rode out to a stretch of barbed wire torn down by a storm. The wire was rusted, sharp enough to slice through gloves, and every post had to be hammered into the rocky ground by hand. Amos's back screamed with every swing of the mallet, and a stray barb cut his forearm, blood mixing with the dirt on his skin. He tied a rag around the wound, knowing infection was a risk but too tired to care. Jake, limping worse by the hour, cursed under his breath. "This job'll kill us before we're 30, he said, spitting into the dust. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Amos's body was a map of pain, blisters on his hands, bruises on his legs, a headache from dehydration that pulsed behind his eyes. He'd worked 16 hours straight, with no end in sight. Hargrove rode up, his horse sleek and well-fed, unlike Clara, hers restless. He barked, "You're on night watch, Tucker." Amos's heart sank. Night watch meant hours in the saddle, circling the herd in the dark, fighting off sleep and wolves alike. He nodded, knowing refusal wasn't an option. Hargrove didn't care about tired men or sick horses. He cared about his cattle. The night was colder than the day, the wind cutting through Amos's thin coat like a knife. Clara plodded along, her steps uneven. As they circled the herd, the longhorns shifted uneasily, their eyes glinting in the moonlight. Amos's eyelids grew heavy, the rhythm of Clara's gait lulling him towards sleep. He pinched his arm to stay awake, the pain a sharp reminder of his reality. A sudden movement in the shadows snapped him alert. A coyote, or maybe a rustler. Urges, his hand went to his revolver, but his fingers were too stiff to grip it properly. If it was trouble, he'd be too slow to stop it. Hours later, as the sky began to lighten, Amos rode back to the bunkhouse, his body numb with fatigue, but rest was cut short. Red, the coughing cowboy, had collapsed during the night, his face gray, his breath rattling. The men carried him to a cot, but there was no doctor, no medicine, just Hargrove's grunted order to keep working. Amos watched as Red's eyes fluttered, his chest barely moving. By morning, he was gone, his body wrapped in a blanket and buried in a shallow grave behind the barn. No one said a word. They couldn't afford to. Amos lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling as the triangle bell rang again. Another day, another grind. His hands bled through the rag he'd wrapped around them, and his stomach growled. The single meal a day, never enough. This was the cowboy life, not riding into the sunset, but slogging through an endless cycle of pain and exhaustion. He thought of Eli's words, of Red's lifeless body, and felt a hollowness settle in his chest. The West wasn't a land of opportunity. It was a machine that used men up and discarded them, and Amos was just another cog, turning until it broke. Amos leaned against the corral fence, his hands trembling as he counted the coins in his palm. $10, his pay for a month of back-breaking work at Hargrove's ranch. The Wyoming wind whipped dust across his boots, and the late October sun did little to warm the chill in his bones. He'd been at the ranch for 30 days, branding calves until his hands bled, mending fences until his back screamed, and riding night watch until his eyes burned. $10. It was a cruel joke, barely enough to buy a decent meal, let alone build a life. He tucked the coins into his pocket, the weight of them feeling more like a shackle than a reward. The other cowboys gathered near the bunkhouse, their faces drawn as they clutched their own meager earnings. Eli, the young kid with hollow cheeks, stared at his pay like it was a betrayal. Jake, the limping cowboy, muttered curses under his breath, his fingers tightening around a crumpled dollar bill. "This ain't enough to live on," Jake said, his voice rough with anger. "Hargrove's getting rich while we starve." Amos nodded, but his throat was too tight to speak. He'd come west dreaming of freedom, of staking a claim to something better. Instead, he was trapped, his labor worth less than the cattle he herded. Hargrove had ridden off to Cheyenne that morning, leaving the crew to fend for themselves until the next job. Amos decided to follow, hoping to stretch his $10 into something useful. New boots, maybe, or enough food to quiet the constant gnawing in his gut. He saddled Clara, her ribs more prominent than ever, and rode the 10 miles to town. Cheyenne was a sprawl of saloons, boarding houses, and shops, its streets bustling with ranchers, miners, and drifters. The air smelled of whiskey and horse dung, and the noise of clinking glasses and shouting men filled Amos with a mix of hope and dread. Maybe here he could find a way to make his money go further. The general store was a squat building, with a faded sign that read McAllister's Goods. Inside, the shelves were stocked with tins of beans, sacks of flour, and boots that looked like they'd last more than a month. Amos's mouth watered at the sight of a jar of pickled eggs, but his heart sank when he saw the prices scrawled on a chalkboard. A pair of boots, $12, a tin of beans, 50 cents, a single egg, a quart. He did the math in his head, his stomach twisting. His $10 wouldn't buy much more than a week's worth of food, and even that was generous. The storekeeper, a wiry man with a mustache like a broom, eyed Amos like he was a vagrant. "What do you want, cowboy?" he asked, his tone sharp. Amos hesitated, then pointed to a sack of flour and a small tin of coffee. "How much for these?" The storekeeper smirked. "Flour's $2, coffee's $1.50. You got cash?" Amos nodded, handing over $3.50. Wincing as his pocket grew lighter, he added a strip of jerky for another $1, leaving him with $5.50. No boots, no eggs, no hope of replacing the coat that was more holes than fabric. As he stepped outside, clutching his purchases, Amos overheard 2 ranchers laughing nearby. "Them cowboys'll work themselves to death for pennies," one said, puffing on a cigar. "And they'll still come back for more." The words hit Amos like a fist. He was nothing to these men, just cheap labor, disposable as a worn-out saddle. He thought of Hargrove, living in a fine house, while Amos and the others slept on lice-infested cots. The unfairness of it burned, but what could he do? Refuse to work and starve, steal and risk a noose. The West didn't care about justice. Not a cat. Back at the ranch, Amos shared his coffee with Eli, who looked ready to cry. "I thought I'd save up, maybe get a plot of land someday," Eli said, his voice small. "But this," he held up his own $10, his hands shaking. Amos wanted to comfort him, but the truth was too heavy. Instead, he poured the weak coffee into a tin cup. The aroma, a faint promise of better days that never came. That night, Jake disappeared into Cheyenne, his pay burning a hole in his pocket. Amos heard him talk about the gambling tables, where a man could double his money with a lucky hand. By morning, Jake was back, his eyes bloodshot, his money gone. "Thought I could win enough to quit this life," he said, his voice hollow. "Lost it all to a rigged game." Amos felt a pang of pity, but also fear. Gambling, drinking, women, every temptation in town was designed to fleece cowboys of what little they had. The saloons and card tables were traps, and men like Amos were the prey. The days dragged on, each one a repeat of the last. Work, hunger, exhaustion. Amos's $5 dwindled to nothing, spent on a patched blanket and a tin of peaches he shared with the crew. He thought of his family back in Ohio, of the letters he'd stopped writing because he had nothing to say but failure. The dime novels had lied about the cowboy life, painting it as a grand adventure. The reality was starvation wages, endless toil, and a system that kept men like Amos poor while ranchers and merchants grew fat. One evening, as the crew sat around a fire, Eli spoke up. "Why don't we demand more pay, all of us, together?" The men fell silent, their faces tense. Jake shook his head. "Hargrove, fire us all. Plenty of desperate fools to take our place." Amos knew Jake was right. The West was full of men like them, chasing the same guckin' dream. Standing up to Hargrove meant risking everything, and they had so little to lose, it hardly seemed worth it. Aunt Amos lay in the bunkhouse, the wind howling outside. He clutched his empty coin purse. $10 a month for a life of pain and hunger. The West wasn't a land of opportunity. It was a thief, stealing hope and strength and giving nothing back. He closed his eyes, the weight of his poverty pressing down like a stone. Tomorrow, he'd work again, because he had no choice. But the dream that had brought him here was dead, buried under the weight of starvation wages. The Wyoming plains stretched out like an ocean of grass and dust, endless and unyielding under a sky that seemed to mock Amos with its vastness. He rode Clara along the edge of Hargrove's herd, the lowing of the cattle the only sound breaking the silence. It was late November 1878, and the days had grown shorter, the nights colder, wrapping the world in a quiet so deep it felt like drowning. Amos had been at the ranch for 2 months now, his body hardened by the grind, his spirit worn thin by the solitude. The cowboy life, he'd learned, wasn't just about hard work or starvation wages. It was about being alone, truly alone, in a way that ate at your soul. Night watch was the work, hours in the saddle, circling the herd under a star-streaked sky, with nothing but your thoughts and the occasional howl of a coyote for company. Amos's breath fogged in the frigid air, his fingers numb around the rein. Clara plodded along, her steps mechanical, as if she too felt the weight of the emptiness. He tried to talk to her sometimes, muttering about the weather or the ache in his back, but her silence only made his own feel heavier. There was no one to share a laugh with, no one to tell about the dreams that had brought him west. Just him, the cattle, and the endless dark. Back in Ohio, Amos had never been alone, not really. There was always a neighbor to jaw with, a sister to tease, a mother to nag him about chores. Even when he'd worked the fields until his hands bled, there'd been someone to sit with at supper, someone to remind him he was part of something. Out here, there was nothing but the job. The other cowboys, Jake, Eli, and the rest were too tired, too broken to talk much. The bunkhouse was a place to sleep, not to connect. Conversations were short, clipped, about the weather or the herd, never about hopes or fears. To speak of those was to admit weakness, and weakness got you nowhere in the West. Amos's mind wandered as he rode, drifting to a girl he'd known back east, Sarah, with her freckled nose and quick laugh. He'd courted her for a summer, dreaming of a life together, but she'd wanted stability, a farm, a family. Amos had wanted adventure, so he'd left her behind, promising to write. He hadn't. What could he say? That he was starving, that he slept on a cot that smelled of mildew, that the West was a lie. The memory of her face, once so clear, was fading now, like a photograph left in the sun. He wondered if she'd married, if she ever thought of him. The thought twisted in his chest, a dull ache that matched the cold seeping through his tattered coat. The herd stirred, a few longhorns shifting uneasily, and Amos snapped back to the present. He nudged Clara forward, scanning the shadows for wolves or rustlers. The darkness played tricks, turning bushes into men, whispers into threats. He'd heard stories of cowboys driven mad by the solitude, men who started talking to themselves, then screaming, then wandering off into the plains never to be seen again. Amos wasn't there yet, but he felt the edge of it, the way the silence pressed against his skull, making every thought louder, heavier. Back at the bunkhouse, the other men were no better off. Lewe, the youngest, had taken to carving bits of wood into crude figures, his hands shaking as he worked. One night, he showed Amos a tiny horse, its legs uneven but recognizable. "Reminds me of home," Eli said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Had a pony once." Amos nodded, unsure what to say. He wanted to ask about Eli's home, his family, but the words felt intrusive, like prying into a wound. Instead, he handed Eli a piece of jerky, a small gesture that felt like all he could offer. Jake, the limping cowboy, was worse. He'd stopped talking much, his eyes distant, as if he were already halfway gone. One evening, as the crew sat around a fire, Jake stared into the flames, muttering about a brother he'd lost to fever years ago. "Ain't no one left for me," he said, his voice flat. "Just this." He gestured at the plains, the herd, the endless nothing, Amos felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He wondered how long it would take for him to become like Jake, hollowed out by the loneliness, a shell of the man who'd left Ohio with stars in his eyes. The days blurred together, each one a repetition of work and silence. Amos tried to fill the void with small things, singing old hymns under his breath, counting the stars, imagining letters he'd never write. But the plains swallowed everything, sound and hope alike. One night, as he rode night watch, a meteor streaked across the sky, bright and fleeting. Amos watched it burn out, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. He wanted to believe it was a sign, a promise of something better, but he knew better. The West didn't give signs, it gave hardship and silence, and you either endured it or broke. By week's end, Amos noticed a change in the bunkhouse. A new cowboy, a man named Caleb, had arrived, his eyes still bright with the kind of hope Amos had lost. Caleb talked too much, about a girl he'd left in Missouri, about plans to buy land someday. The others ignored him, their silence a warning. Amos wanted to tell Caleb to save his dreams, to go back before the plains stole them, but he did. Instead, he watched as Caleb's chatter faded over the days, his smile dimming under the weight of the work and the loneliness. It was like watching a mirror of his own past, and it hurt more than Amos expected. As he lay on his cot, the wind howling outside, Amos thought of Sarah again, of the life he might have had. The loneliness of the plains wasn't just the absence of people, it was the absence of connection, of meaning. He was surrounded by men, by cattle, by miles of open land, but he'd never felt so alone. The West had promised freedom, but all it gave was isolation, a solitude so deep it could swallow a man whole. Tomorrow, he'd ride again, work again, but tonight, he let himself feel the ache, knowing there was no escape from the loneliness of the plain. The Wyoming night was black as pitch, the kind of dark that swallowed sound and sight, leaving only the nervous lowing of the cattle and the creak of Amos's saddle. It was early December 1878, and Amos was on night watch again, riding Clara, along the edge of Hargrove's herd. The air was sharp with frost, biting through his threadbare coat and numbing his finger. His revolver, a heavy weight at his hip, felt more like a burden than a comfort. He'd never fired it at a man, only at snakes and the occasional coyote, but the stories of rustlers, bands of outlaws who'd slit your throat for a steer, kept him on edge. The cowboy life wasn't just hard labor or loneliness, it was a constant dance with death, and Amos was no dancer. The herd was restless, their hooves stirring the dust as they shifted in the corral. Amos scanned the shadows, his eyes straining against the darkness. He'd heard whispers in the bunkhouse about a gang hitting ranches nearby, stealing cattle and leaving bodies in their wake.
Hargrove had brushed off the rumors, saying his men could handle it, but Amos wasn't so sure. The crew was tired, underfed, and armed with old pistols and rifles that jammed more often than they fired. If trouble came, they'd be outmatched. A faint sound, a twig snapping, jerked Amos upright. Clara's ears flicked, her body tensing beneath him. He tightened his grip on the reins, his heart pounding, as he peered into the gloom. It could have been a deer, a wolf, or nothing at all. Pierre, with the hairs on his neck, stood up. Then he saw them, shapes moving low and fast, like ghosts, slipping through the sagebrush. 5, maybe 6 men, their faces hidden by bandanas, their horses silent as they closed in on the herd. Rustlers. Amos's first instinct was to shout for the others, but the bunkhouse was too far, and a yell would give him away. He nudged Clara behind a cluster of rocks, his breath shallow as he counted the figures. They moved with purpose, cutting out a dozen steers with practiced ease. Amos's mind raced. If he did nothing, Hargrove would blame the crew, maybe dock their pay or fire them. If he acted, he could end up dead. The West didn't reward heroes, it buried them. He slid his revolver from its holster, the metal cold, against his palm. His hand shook, not from the chill but from fear. He'd never shot a man, never wanted to, But the rustlers were driving the cattle now, their figures fading into the dark. Amos thought of Eli, the young cowboy who'd carved that wooden horse, and Jake, already broken by the grind. Losing the herd would crush them all. He cursed under his breath and spurred Clara forward, keeping low as he followed the rustler's trail. The chase led him across the plains, the herd's dust a faint guide in the moonlight. Amos's heart thudded as he closed the gap, his revolver cocked. He didn't have a plan, just a desperate need to do something. Then a shot rang out, a bullet whizzing past his ear, and Clara reared, nearly throwing him. The rustlers had seen him. Amos ducked, firing blindly into the dark, the recoil jarring his arm. Shouts erupted, followed by more gunfire, the flashes lighting up masked faces and glinting steel. Amos's world narrowed to chaos, hooves pounding, cattle bellowing, bullets tearing through the air. He aimed at a shadow, firing again, and heard a scream. A man fell, clutching his chest, but there was no time to think. Another rustler charged, his horse bearing down, a knife gleaming in his hand. Amos yanked Clara's reins, dodging as the blade sliced the air where his head had been. He fired again, the rustler's horse veering as its rider slumped, blood soaking the ground. The herd scattered, panicked by the gunfire, and Amos struggled to keep Clara steady. He glimpsed Eli and Jake riding up, their rifles blazing, but the rustlers were relentless. A bullet grazed Amos's shoulder, the pain hot and sharp, blood seeping through his shirt. He gritted his teeth, firing until his revolver clicked empty. The rustlers, outnumbered now, turned and fled, leaving two of their own behind, motionless in the dirt. The fight was over as quickly as it began, the silence that followed heavier than the gunfire. Amos dismounted, his legs shaking as he checked his shoulder. The wound was shallow, but it burned like fire. Eli rode up, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. "You hit?" he asked, his voice trembling. Amos nodded, tying a rag around the wound. Jake limped over, his rifle still smoking. "We got most of the herd back," he said, but his voice was flat. Amos looked at the bodies on the ground, two rustlers, one still clutching a knife, the other staring blankly at the sky. Back at the ranch, Hargrove was waiting, his face red with fury. "You let him get away with 10 head, he roared, spitting tobacco. Amos wanted to snap back, to point out the blood on his shirt, the bodies they'd left behind, but he held his tongue. Hargrove didn't care about their lives, only his cattle. "You'll work double to make up for it," he said, turning away. "No thanks, no concern for the wounded, just more demands." In the bunkhouse, Amos sat with Eli and Jake, the air thick with the smell of blood and gunpowder. Eli was quiet, his hands shaking as he cleaned his rifle. Jake stared at the floor, his limp worse than ever. "Could have been us out there, could have been us out there," he said, his voice barely audible. Amos nodded, the weight of the night settling in his chest. He'd killed a man, maybe two, and the thought made his stomach churn. The dime novels made gunfights sound glorious, but there was no glory here, just fear and death, and a rancher who didn't care. As Amos lay on his cot, his shoulder throbbing, he thought of the rustlers' faces, hidden behind bandanas.
Were they so different from him? Desperate men, pushed to the edge by a West that offered nothing but hardship. The cowboy life wasn't about heroism or adventure. It was about surviving dangers that came from every direction, from outlaws to ranchers, to the land itself. Tomorrow, he'd ride again, bleed again, because he had no choice. But the weight of the night's violence clung to him, another scar on a soul already battered by the Wild West. The Wyoming sky was a slab of gray, heavy with the threat of snow, as Amos rode out with the crew to drive a herd of longhorns to a winter pasture. It was mid-December, 1878, and the air bit at his exposed skin, the cold seeping through his patched coat and into his bones. His shoulder, still sore from the rustler fight 2 weeks ago, ached with every jolt of Clara's uneven gait. The wound had scabbed over, but the memory of that night lingered, as did the weight of the lives he'd taken. Now,
As the wind howled across the plains, Amos felt a new kind of dread. The West wasn't just men with guns or starvation wages. It was nature itself, a merciless force that could kill you as surely as a bullet. Hargrove had ordered the drive despite the darkening sky, his voice sharp as he dismissed the crew's concerns. "Storm's days off," he'd said, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "Get those cattle moved or you're done." Amos knew better than to argue. Hargrove didn't care about the weather any more than he cared about the men. The crew, Amos, Jake, Eli, and a handful of others, saddled up, their faces grim. Clara snorted, her breath clouding in the frigid air, her ribs stark against her hide. Amos patted her neck, whispering an apology for what was to come. The drive started badly. The cattle were skittish, sensing the storm, and the ground was already slick with frost. Amos rode flank, keeping the herd tight, but the wind stung his eyes, making it hard to see. His gloves, worn thin, did little to protect his hands from the reins, and his toes, crammed into boots with holes, were already numb. Jake, limping even in the saddle, cursed the cold, while Eli, barely visible through the dust, looked like a ghost, his face pale and drawn. The plains stretched endlessly, offering no shelter, no mercy. By midday, the sky turned black, and the first snowflakes fell, small at first, then thicker, driven sideways by a wind that screamed like a banshee. Amos pulled his scarf over his face, but it was no use. The snow stung like needles, clogging his eyelashes and soaking his clothes. The cattle panicked, breaking formation, and the crew scrambled to keep them together. Amos spurred Clara forward, shouting into the gale, but his voice was lost. The world was a blur of white, the herd a mass of bellowing shadows. The storm worsened, the snow piling into drifts that swallowed Clara's hooves. Amos's fingers froze to the reins, his breath hitching as the cold tightened his chest. He thought of stories he'd heard, cowboys caught in blizzards, found days later, frozen stiff with their hands still clutching their saddles. He shook the thought away, focusing on the herd, but the cattle were slowing, their heads lowered against the wind. Some collapsed, their legs buckling under the weight of the snow, and Amos knew they'd lose more before the night was over. The crew found a shallow gully by dusk, a pitiful shelter against the storm. They huddled together, tying the horses to a scrubby tree and trying to keep the remaining cattle from bolting. Amos's teeth chattered as he helped Jake build a fire, but the wind snuffed out every spark. Eli, shivering so hard he could barely speak, wrapped his thin blanket around himself, his eyes wide with fear. "We're gonna die out here," he whispered. Amos wanted to argue, to offer hope, but his own fear choked the words. The West didn't care about their survival. The night was endless. Amos took turns with Jake and Caleb, the new cowboy, circling the herd to keep them from scattering. The cold was a living thing, clawing at his skin, numbing his thoughts. His toes, now black at the tips, burned with a pain that made him gasp. Clara stumbled, her strength fading, and Amos whispered to her, promising rest he wasn't sure they'd find. At one point, he dismounted to check a fallen steer, only to find it frozen, its eyes glazed over in death. The sight hit him like a blow. Another loss, another failure. By morning, the storm had eased, but the damage was done. Half the herd was dead or missing, buried in drifts, or scattered across the plains. Amos's toes were blacker now, the skin peeling, and he knew frostbite would leave its mark. Jake's limp was worse, his face gray with exhaustion, and Eli looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. Caleb, the hopeful new man, was silent, his dreams of the West buried under the snow. They limped back to the ranch, the surviving cattle trailing behind, their heads low.
Hargrove was waiting, his face a mask of rage. "You lost half my herd," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the yard. Amos, too cold and tired to care, stood silent as Hargrove ranted. There was no mention of the storm, no concern for the men who'd nearly died. Just blame,
and a promise to dock their pay for the losses. Amos's anger flared, but he swallowed it. What was the point? The West didn't reward courage, it punished it. In the bunkhouse, Amos sat by a feeble fire, trying to warm his hands. His toes throbbed, and he feared he'd lose them, like a cowboy he'd known in Texas, who'd walked on stumps after a bad winter. When Eli sat nearby, staring at his wooden horse carving, his hands shaking, Jake, his eyes hollow, muttered about quitting, but they all knew he wouldn't. Where else could they go? The storm had shown them the truth. Nature was as cruel as the men who ruled the West, and cowboys were at the mercy of both. As Amos lay on his cot, the wind still howling outside, he thought of the frozen steer, its eyes staring into nothing. The West was a graveyard, not just for cattle, but for men, their hopes buried under snow and hardship. The cowboy life wasn't adventure. It was a fight against a land that wanted you dead, with no one to care if you lost. Tomorrow, he'd work again, because he had to, but the cold had settled in his bones, a reminder that nature's cruelty spared no one. The bunkhouse at Hargrove's ranch reeked of sweat and sickness, a sour stench that clung to the walls and seeped into Amos's dreams. It was late December 1878, and the Wyoming winter had settled in, the cold a constant ache in his frost-bitten toes. The storm from the cattle drive had left its mark, not just on the herd, but on the men. Amos's shoulder wound from the rustler fight had healed unevenly, a puckered scar that itched under his shirt. But now, a new threat loomed, one that no gun or grit could fight. Dizzy, cowboy life wasn't just about outlaws or blizzards. It was about bodies breaking down, rotting from the inside, with no one to help. It started with Caleb, the new cowboy who'd arrived with dreams of glory. A week after the storm, he'd woken coughing, a wet, hacking sound that rattled his thin frame. By the next day, his eyes were glassy, his skin hot to the touch, just a cold. He'd muttered, but Amos knew better. He'd seen it before, on a drive in Texas. Dysentery, cholera, or some other fever that swept through men like wildfire. The bunkhouse, with its damp walls and shared blankets, was a breeding ground for sickness, and the cowboys, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, were easy prey. Amos felt it soon after. His stomach churned, a twisting pain that doubled him over. By evening, he was running to the outhouse every hour, his body purging what little he'd eaten. The other men weren't spared. Eli, the young cowboy, was pale as death, his wooden horse carving forgotten, as he curled up on his cot, shivering. Jake, already limping from old injuries, vomited into a bucket, his curses weak and slurred. The bunkhouse became a hospital of despair, the air thick with moans and the smell of bile. There was no doctor. Hargrove, true to form, cared only for his cattle, not his men. When Amos staggered to the main house to beg for help, Hargrove waved him off. "Ain't paying for no sawbones," he said, spitting tobacco. "Drink some whiskey and tough it out." Amos wanted to scream, to shake the man until he understood the pain, but he was too weak. He stumbled back to the bunkhouse, clutching a bottle of cheap liquor. Hargrove had tossed him like a bone to a dog. Whiskey wasn't medicine, it was a lie, like everything else in the West. The crew tried to help each other, but they had nothing to offer. Amos boiled water over a fire, hoping to ease the sickness, but the stream they drew from was muddy, likely part of the problem. Eli, barely conscious, whispered about his mother, how she'd known herbs that could cure anything. Amos listened, his heart heavy, knowing no herbs would reach them here. Jake, his face gaunt, offered a tin of patent medicine he'd bought in Cheyenne, a foul-smelling tonic that promised miracles, but did nothing. Amos forced it down, gagging on the bitter taste, and felt no better. Caleb's condition worsened fastest. By the third day, he couldn't stand, his cough turning to a gurgle, blood flecking his lips. Amos sat by his cot, wiping the younger man's brow with a rag, but it was useless. Caleb's eyes, once bright with hope, were dull, staring at the ceiling as if seeing something beyond it. "Should have stayed in Missouri," he whispered, his voice a rasp. Amos held his hand, the only comfort he could give. And when Caleb's breathing stopped that night, the silence was louder than any storm.
They buried him at dawn, in a shallow grave beside Red's from months before. No preacher, no words, just a few men too sick to stand straight, shoveling dirt under a grey skies. Sure, a grave didn't show. Needn't even ask about Caleb. Amos's anger burned, but it was drowned by exhaustion and fear. His own sickness lingered, a fever that left him dizzy, his toes still black from frostbite, now swollen and oozed. He knew what infection could do. Another cowboy, back in Texas, had lost a leg to a cut no bigger than a dime. Amputation was a death sentence out here, with no doctor, and only a rusty knife. The days blurred into a haze of pain and weakness. Amos forced himself to work, dragging himself to the corral to check the herd, but every step was agony. Eli recovered enough to help, though his eyes were haunted, his hands shaking as he saddled his horse. Jake wasn't so lucky. His sickness turned to a fever that burned through him, and by week's end, he was gone, his body joining Caleb's in the dirt. 2 graves in a week, and Amos felt the weight of each like a stone on his chest. The surviving crew whispered about leaving, but where could they go? The nearest town was Cheyenne, 10 miles away, and none of them had the strength or money for the journey. Amos thought of his own body, betraying him with every step. His toes were worse now, the skin peeling away, the smell of decay faint but unmistakable. He soaked them in whiskey, the only thing he had, and prayed it would be enough. But prayer felt hollow in a place like this, where God seemed as absent as mercy. One night, as Amos lay on his cot, his fever spiking, he dreamed of Ohio, green fields, a warm kitchen, his mother's voice. He woke sweating, his heart pounding, the bunkhouse dark and cold. Eli sat nearby, carving another wooden figure, his face lit by a flickering candle. "You think we'll make it?" Eli asked, his voice small. Amos wanted to lie, to say yes, but the truth was too heavy. "I don't know," he said, and it was the most honest thing he'd said in months. The cowboy life wasn't just hard, it was a slow death, not from bullets or storms, but from the quiet killers. Disease, infection, neglect. The West offered no doctors, no hospitals, just men like Amos, left to rot in bunkhouses, while ranchers counted their profits. As he closed his eyes, the fever pulling him under, Amos felt the truth settle in his bones. The Wild West wasn't a land of dreams, it was a place where men decayed, body and soul, with no one to save them. The Cheyenne saloon was a haze of smoke and noise, the air thick with the stench of whiskey, sweat, and desperation. It was early January 1879, and Amos had ridden into town with Eli, seeking a moment's escape from the grind of Hargrove's ranch. His fever had broken after weeks of sickness, but his body was a shadow of itself. His frostbitten toes still ached, his stomach hollow from hunger, his spirit worn thin by loss. The saloon promised warmth, a drink, maybe a fleeting sense of being alive, but Amos should have known better. The Wild West didn't offer escape, only traps, and the cowboy life wasn't about heroic gunfights. It was about surviving the messy, terrifying reality of violence. Amos and Eli pushed through the swinging doors of the Rusty Spur, a rundown joint packed with miners, drifters, and cowboys like them, all chasing oblivion in a glass. The room was loud with laughter and curses, a piano clanging in the corner, its notes off-key but relentless. Amos's $10 pay from the last month was already gone, spent on a new pair of gloves and a tin of beans, but Eli had $1 left, enough for a couple of drinks. They elbowed their way to the bar, the wooden floor sticky under their boots, and ordered 2 whiskeys. The liquor burned Amos's throat, cheap and harsh, but it dulled the ache in his bone. Eli, still pale from the dysentery that had swept the bunkhouse, sipped his drink, his eyes darting nervously. "Feels good to be out of that damn ranch," he said, forcing a smile. Amos nodded, but his heart wasn't in it. The saloon was no sanctuary, just another place where men like them were fleeced of what little they had. He scanned the room, his hand resting near his revolver, a habit born of the Rustler fight. The weight of that night still clung to him, the memory of blood and screams,
a shadow he couldn't shake. Trouble found them faster than Amos expected. A burly man at a card table, his face red with drink, slammed his fist down, accusing a wiry cowboy of cheating. The cowboy, a stranger with a scar across his cheek, laughed, his hand hovering over his pistol. The room tensed, conversations dying as eyes turned to the table. Amos grabbed Eli's arm, ready to slip out, but the crowd pressed in, blocking their path. "Stay low," he whispered, his pulse quickening.
He'd read about gunfights in dime novels, noble duels under a noonday sun, quick draws and clean kills. The reality was nothing like that. The argument exploded into chaos. The burly man drew first, his pistol flashing, but the shot went wide, shattering a bottle behind the bar. The scarred cowboy fired back, his bullet catching the man in the shoulder, blood spraying across the table. The crowd surged, some diving for cover, others shouting. The crowd surged, some diving for cover, others shouting, the few pulling their own guns. Amos shoved Eli behind a pillar, his revolver in hand, his heart pounding. He didn't want to shoot, didn't want to kill again, but the saloon was a powder keg, and he was caught in the middle. A stray bullet grazed the pillar, splintering wood inches from Amos's face. He ducked, dragging Eli down, as another shot rang out, this one hitting a lantern that crashed to the floor, spilling oil that caught fire. The flames spread fast, licking at the dry wood of the saloon. Panic erupted. Men shoved and screamed, trampling each other to reach the doors. Amos's eyes stung from smoke, his lungs burning as he pulled Eli toward the exit. But the scarred cowboy, wild with rage, blocked their path, his pistol aimed at the burly man, who was crawling across the floor, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Amos acted on instinct. He tackled the scarred cowboy, his revolver skittering across the floor. The man roared, swinging a fist that caught Amos's jaw, sending him sprawling. Pain exploded in his head, but he scrambled up, grabbing a chair and smashing it over the cowboy's back. The man collapsed, groaning, and Amos grabbed Eli, hauling him through the chaos. The bullet whizzed past, embedding in the wall, and Amos's stomach lurched. This wasn't a duel, it was a slaughter, sloppy and senseless. They stumbled into the street, coughing as smoke poured from the saloon. Behind them, the fire roared, the building creaking as flames consumed it. Men spilled out, some dragging the wounded, others running for their lives. The scarred cowboy was nowhere to be seen, but the burly man lay in the dirt, his eyes glassy, blood pooling beneath him. Amos's hands shook as he checked Eli, who was unharmed but trembling, his face white with shock. "I didn't sign up for this," Eli whispered, his voice breaking. The sheriff arrived too late, his deputies dousing the fire with buckets of water from a nearby trough. No one was arrested. There were too many guns, too many stories, and no one cared enough to sort it out. Amos and Eli rode back to the ranch in silence, the whiskey sour in their stomachs, the night's violence a weight they couldn't shake. Amos's jaw throbbed, and his mind replayed the fight, the blood, the fire, the fear. He'd killed before, in the rustler fight, but this was different. It was pointless, a drunken brawl that left men dead for nothing. Hargrove greeted them with a scowl, demanding to know why they'd left the herd unattended. Amos didn't bother explaining. Hargrove wouldn't care about the saloon, the fire, or the dead. He only cared about his cattle. In the bunkhouse, Amos sat on his cot, his hands still shaking. Eli stared at his wooden horse, his fingers tracing its uneven lines. Thought gunfights were supposed to be heroic, he said, his voice hollow. Amos nodded, the dime novel's lies burning in his mind. Gunfights weren't glorious. They were terrifying, messy, and left you with blood on your hands and guilt in your heart. He lay down, the saloon smoke still clinging to his clothes. Amos felt the weight of the night settle in his chest. He'd survived, but at what cost? The cowboy life wasn't about standing tall in a duel.
It was about dodging bullets in a world that didn't care if you lived or died. The West had promised adventure, but all it gave was chaos, and Amos was tired of paying the price. The Wyoming wind carried a bite as sharp as a blade, rattling the bunkhouse windows as Amos sat on his cot, staring at the empty coin purse in his hands. It was mid-January, 1879, and the weight of the past months, disease, violence, starvation, wages had carved lines into his face that made him look a decade older than his 23 years. His frost-bitten toes still throbbed, his body weak from the lingering effects of dysentery, and the memory of the saloon fight burned in his mind. But today, a new wound festered. Hargrove had promised a bonus for the crew's work through the winter, a rare flicker of hope that had kept Amos and the others going. Now, that promise lay shattered, like everything else in the Wild West. The talk of a bonus had started before the storm, when Hargrove, in a rare moment of generosity, had dangled the prospect of extra pay for driving the herd through the worst of the winter. $10 each, maybe more, he'd said, his tobacco-stained grin convincing enough to spark hope. For Amos, it was a lifeline, a chance to buy new boots, maybe save enough to leave this life behind.
Eli had dreamed of sending money to his family, and even Caleb, before the fever took him, had talked of buying a plot of land. The promise had been a beacon, something to cling to through the cold, the sickness, and the bloodshed. But when payday came, Hargrove's tune changed. The crew gathered in the corral, their breath fogging in the icy air, as Hargrove handed out their usual $10 each. No bonus, no explanation, just a grunt and a wave of his hand. "Storm cost me too much," he said, spitting into the dirt. "You're lucky to get this." Amos's stomach twisted, his hands clenching around the coins. They'd risked their lives, lost Caleb, lost Jake, lost half the herd, and Hargrove offered nothing but excuses. The other cowboys stood silent, their faces a mix of anger and resignation. Eli's eyes glistened, his hands trembling as he pocketed his pay. "He lied," Eli whispered, his voice breaking. Amos nodded, the betrayal a knife in his gut. The bunkhouse that night was a cauldron of discontent. The surviving crew, Amos, Eli, and a few others, sat around a flickering fire, their voices low but sharp with anger. "We worked ourselves to death for that bastard," said a cowboy named Tom, his face scarred from a branding iron mishap. "And he gives us nothing." Eli, usually quiet, slammed his fist on a crate. "We should demand it, all of us, together." The idea hung in the air, dangerous and tempting. Amos felt it too, the urge to march to Hargrove's house and demand what was owed. But he knew the truth. Cowboys had no power. Hargrove could fire them all, replace them with fresh drifters, desperate for any work. The West didn't care about fairness. It rewarded the powerful, and men like Amos were nothing. Still, the idea took root. The next morning, Amos, Eli, and Tom approached Hargrove at the main house, their hats in hand, but their eyes hard. Amos spoke first, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. "You promised us a bonus, Mr. Hargrove. We lost men, lost cattle, and we're still here. Where's our pay?" Hargrove's face darkened, his mustache twitching as he chewed his tobacco. "You think you can demand from me?" he snarled. "You're lucky I don't kick you out for losing my herd. Get back to work, or you're done." Amos's anger flared, but Tom stepped forward, his voice shaking. "We ain't your slaves. Pay us what's owed, or we walk." Hargrove laughed, a cold, ugly sound. "Walk, then. Plenty of fools like you out there." He turned away, dismissing them like flies. Amos grabbed Tom's arm before he could lunge, pulling him back to the bunkhouse. The crew was silent, the weight of Hargrove's words crushing their brief spark of defiance. Eli sat on his cot, staring at his wooden horse, his face pale. "What's the point?" he muttered. "We're nothing to him." Amos wanted to argue, to say they could fight, but the truth was clear. Hargrove held all the cards, and they had none. The days that followed were grim. The crew worked harder,
as if to prove their worth. But the promise of the bonus haunted them. Amos's anger simmered, fueled by the memory of Hargrove's laugh, the way he dismissed their lives. He thought of Caleb, dead from fever, and Jake, buried in the snow, their sacrifices meaningless to a man who saw them as tools. The cowboy life wasn't just hard, it was a betrayal. A system where promises were made to keep men working, then broken to keep them poor. One night, Tom disappeared, leaving a note scratched on a piece of wood, gone to find better. Amos envied his courage, but feared his fate. The West was full of ranches like Hargrove's, each with its own tyrant, each offering the same empty promises. Eli, quieter now, stopped carving, his hands idle as if the fight had drained him. Amos felt it too, the slow death of hope. He'd come west chasing a dream, but the reality was a cycle of exploitation, where men like him were used up and discarded, their labor worth less than the cattle they drove. As Amos lay on his cot, the wind howling outside, he clutched his $10, the coins cold against his palm. The West had promised opportunity, but all it gave was lies. Lies from ranchers, lies from dime novels, lies from his own heart. Tomorrow, he'd work again, because he had no choice. But the weight of broken promises pressed down, a reminder that the cowboy life was a trap, and he was caught in it, body and soul. The Wyoming dawn was a faint bruise on the horizon, casting a pale light over Hargrove's ranch, as Amos led Clara from the stable. It was late January 1879, and the air was sharp with frost, stinging his cracked lips and numbing his fingers. His body bore the scars of the past months, frost-bitten toes, a puckered wound from the rustler fight, the lingering weakness of dysentery.
But Clara, his mare, had been his constant, the one thing in this brutal West that hadn't betrayed him. She'd carried him through storms, gunfights, and endless miles of dust, a steady gait, a lifeline in a world that offered none. Now, as she limped beside him, her head low and her steps uneven, Amos felt a dread deeper than any he'd known. The cowboy life didn't just break men, it broke their horses, too, and Clara was fading. Amos had bought Clara 3 years ago in Texas, trading a month's wages for her wiry frame and stubborn spirit. She wasn't much to look at, bony, with a patchy coat and a temper that she was tough, smarter than most men he'd met. She'd saved his life more than once, sensing dangers he couldn't, a rattlesnake in the grass, a rustler in the shadows, in the lonely nights on the plains, when the silence pressed like a weight. Amos had talked to her, spilling dreams and fears he'd never share with another soul. Clara didn't judge, didn't laugh, she just listened, her ears flicking, her warmth of comfort confessed the cold. But the West had been as cruel to her as it was to Amos. The long drives, the scarce feed, the brutal winter storm, they'd worn her down. Her ribs jutted like fence posts, her coat dull, her eyes clouded with fatigue. This morning, as Amos saddled her for another day of herding, she stumbled, her left foreleg buckling under her weight. He knelt beside her, running his hand along her leg, feeling the heat and swelling in her fetlock. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his throat tight. He knew lameness in a horse was a death sentence out here. A cowboy without a horse was nothing, and a horse that couldn't work was a liability. Amos led Clara to the corral, hoping rest might help, but Hargrove was waiting, his face sour as ever. "What's wrong with that nag?" he barked, spitting tobacco. Amos explained, his voice low, asking for a day to let her heal. Hargrove laughed, a sound like gravel. "Ain't feeding a useless horse. Fix her or get rid of her." Amos's anger flared, but he bit it back. Hargrove didn't care about Clara any more than he cared about the men who'd died. Red, Caleb, Jake. To him, they were all tools, replaceable and disposable. In the bunkhouse, Amos confided in Eli, the only one left he trusted. Eli, still shaken from the saloon fight and Hargrove's broken promises, looked at Clara's swollen leg with a frown. "My pa had a horse go lame once," he said,
His voice soft, wrapped it, kept her off it for weeks. She came back, mostly. Amos nodded, grateful for the hope, however faint. He tore strips from an old shirt, wrapping Clara's leg as tightly as he dared, whispering to her as she snorted in pain. But he had no money for a farrier, no way to buy proper feed or medicine. All he could offer was time, and time was something Hargrove wouldn't give. The days that followed were a torment. Amos worked on foot, borrowing a horse from the rancher's string, a skittish gelding that didn't know him, and fought his every command. Each evening, he tended to Clara, cleaning her wound, feeding her what scraps of hay he could scrounge. Her limp listened, her eyes duller each day. Amos's heart ached as he watched her struggle, her spirit fading like a fire gone to embers. He thought of the miles they'd traveled together, the nights she'd carried him through storms and gunfire. She was more than a horse, she was his partner, his only friend, in a world that offered none. One evening, as Amos sat by Clara in the stable, Eli joined him, his wooden horse carving clutched in his hand. "She's suffering," Eli said, his voice barely audible. Amos shook his head, refusing the truth. "She'll pull through," he said, but his voice cracked deep down. He knew Eli was right. Clara's leg was infected now, the swelling spreading, her breathing labored. Hargrove had noticed, too, and his ultimatum was clear: "Put her down, or I will." The words cut deeper than any bullet, but Amos couldn't bear the thought of a stranger ending her life. The decision came at dawn, under a sky as cold and gray as Amos's heart. He led Clara to a quiet spot behind the barn, away from Hargrove's. His hands shook as he loaded his revolver, the same one he'd used in the rustler fight, now heavy with a different kind of weight. Clara nuzzled his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck, and Amos's eyes burned with tears he hadn't shed in years. "I'm sorry, girl," he whispered, stroking her. "You deserved better." He raised the gun, his finger trembling on the trigger, and fired. The shot echoed across the plains, and Clara fell, her body still at last. Amos buried her alone, his hands blistered from the shovel, his chest tight with grief. Eli offered to help, but Amos refused. He needed to do this himself.
The grave was shallow, the ground hard with frost, but it was all he could give her. As he piled the last of the dirt, he felt something break inside him, a piece of the boy who'd come west, chasing dreams. Clara had been his anchor, and now she was gone. Another casualty of a life that took everything and gave nothing back. In the bunkhouse, Amos sat silent, his hands empty without Clara's reins. Eli tried to comfort him, offering the wooden horse carving, but Amos couldn't look at it. The cowboy life wasn't just about losing men to disease or violence. It was about losing the things that kept you human, the bonds that held you together. Clara had carried his life, and now she was gone, leaving Amos adrift in a West that cared for nothing but profit. Tomorrow, he'd work again, on a borrowed horse, with a heart heavier than ever. But the loss of Clara was a wound that wouldn't heal, a reminder that the Wild West broke everything you loved. The Wyoming plains stretched under a sky as flat and gray as Amos's thoughts, the wind carrying a chill that settled deep in his bones. It was early February 1879, and Amos rode a borrowed horse, a surly gelding that fought his every command, a far cry from Clara's steady trust. Her loss still ached like a fresh wound, her grave behind the barn a silent reminder of all the West had taken, his dreams, his health, his hope. The bunkhouse was quieter now, with Caleb, Jake, and Tom gone, and Eli's spirit fading. Amos felt the weight of it all, the grinding truth that there was no way out of this life. The cowboy life wasn't just hard, it was a cage, and he was locked inside, with no key in sight. Amos had come west, chasing freedom, lured by tales of open land and opportunity, but the reality was a cycle of toil and loss, each day a repeat of the last. Wake before dawn, work until your body screamed, sleep on a lice-ridden cot, and do it again. His $10 pay was gone as soon as it came, eaten up by necessities, gloves, food, a patched blanket, leaving nothing to save.
nothing to build a future. Hargrove's broken promises, the disease that had claimed his friends, the violence that stained his hands, all of it had stripped away the illusions, leaving only the truth. He was trapped. The idea of leaving gnawed at him. He'd lie on his cot at night, staring at the bunkhouse ceiling, imagining riding away to anywhere else, maybe California, where the sun was warm and the land was said to be rich, maybe back to Ohio, to his family, though the thought of returning a failure stung worse than frostbite. But the West was a vast, cruel machine, and escaping it wasn't as simple as saddling up. He had no money, no horse of his own, and no strength left to start over. The nearest town, Cheyenne, was 10 miles away, a journey he could barely make on foot, and even if he did, what then? Another ranch, another Hargrove, another Hargrove, another Amos tried to talk to Eli about it one evening, as they sat by a feeble fire in the bunkhouse. Eli's hands, once busy carving wooden figures, were still now, his eyes hollow. "You ever think about leaving?" Amos asked, his voice low. Eli stared into the flames, his face tight. "Every day," he said. "But where'd I go? Ain't got nothing but this." He gestured at the bunkhouse, the corral, the endless plains. "We're stuck, Amos. Ain't no way out, less you're rich or dead." The words hit like a fist, confirming what Amos feared. Eli was right. The West didn't let men like them go. The work didn't stop. Even as Amos's mind churned with thoughts of escape, Hargrove had them repairing a fence line torn up by a late snow, the barbed wire slicing Amos's hands through his worn gloves. Each post hammered into the frozen ground sent a jolt through his aching shoulders, a reminder of his body's limits. His frostbitten toes, still black at the tips, burned with every step, and the dysentery had left him weak, his ribs sharp under his skin. He was 23, but he felt like an old man, his life draining into the dirt with every swing of the mallet. Hargrove rode by, his horse sleek and well-fed, his coat thick against the cold. "Pick up the pace, Tucker," he barked, not even looking at Amos. The sight of him fat, comfortable, untouched by the misery he inflicted, lit a spark of rage in Amos's chest. He wanted to quit, to throw down the hammer and walk away, but the thought stopped cold. Walk where? With what? The West was a trap, and Hargrove was its jailer, holding their wages, their food, their very survival in his hand. That night, Amos overheard 2 new cowboys, fresh hires to replace the men who died or left, talking about a strike. Heard some miners in Colorado stood up to their boss. One said, his voice eager, "Got better pay, better hours." The other laughed, bitter, "Miners got numbers, we're just a handful," and Hargrove'd have us shot before he paid a cent more. Amos listened, his heart sinking.
A strike was a dream, as empty as Hargrove's promises. Cowboys were too few, too broken, too replaceable. The West didn't bend for men like them. Amos's thoughts turned darker as the days dragged on. He'd seen men give up, drifters who drank themselves to death in Cheyenne, cowboys who wandered into the plains and never came back. He understood them now, the pull of surrender. One morning, as he saddled the gelding, his hands shaking from cold and hunger, he caught his reflection in a trough of icy water. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, a stranger staring back. The boy who'd left Ohio was gone, replaced by this hollow man, chained to a life that offered nothing but pain. Eli noticed the change, his voice soft as he spoke one evening. "You're thinking about giving up, ain't you?" Amos didn't answer, but his silence was enough. Eli reached into his pocket, pulling out the wooden horse he'd carved months ago, its edges worn smooth. "Take it," he said, pressing it into Amos's hand. "Reminds me there's still something worth holding on to." Amos clutched the carving, its weight a small anchor, but it couldn't pull him back from the edge. The West had taken too much. Clara, his friends, his dreams, and he was running out of reasons to fight. As Amos lay on his cot, the
the wind howling outside. He turned the wooden horse over in his hands, its rough lines a faint echo of Clara's strength. He wanted to believe there was a way out, a path to something better, but the truth was a wall he couldn't climb. The cowboy life wasn't a choice, it was a sentence, a slow death by labor, loneliness, and despair. Tomorrow, he'd work again, because he had no other option. But the realization that he was trapped, with no way out, settled in his soul like a stone, heavier than any burden he'd carried before. The Wyoming morning was raw and bitter, the sky a sheet of iron over Hargrove's ranch. As Amos hammered a fence post into the frozen ground, it was mid-February 1879, and the weight of his trapped existence pressed heavier than ever. Clara's grave lay behind the barn, a scar on the earth that mirrored the one in his heart. His body was a wreck, frost-bitten toes throbbing, dysentery's weakness lingering, his hands scarred from barbed wire and gunfights. Eli's wooden horse, tucked in his pocket, was a faint tether to hope, but it wasn't enough. The cowboy life had shown Amos its truth. There was no way out, not unless he made one himself. Today, driven by desperation, he would try, even if it cost him everything. The realization had crystallized the night before. As Amos lay on his cot, the bunkhouse silent save for Eli's soft breathing, he turned the wooden horse over in his hands, its edges worn smooth, and thought of all the West had stolen his dreams, his friends, his horse, his future. Hargrove's broken promises, the starvation wages, the endless toil. It was a chain, and Amos was done wearing it. He couldn't go on like this, a shadow of a man, working himself to death for a rancher who saw him as less than the cattle. Leaving was impossible without money or a horse, but staying was a slow suicide. There was only one path left: to stand up, to demand something better, even if it meant risking it all. The plan, if you could call it that, was reckless. Amos and Eli would confront Hargrove again, not just for the promised bonus but for fair wages, a share of the rancher's profits, something to make their labor worth more than a pittance. They'd rally the remaining crew, the new hires who'd replaced Caleb, Jake, and Tom, and make a stand. It wasn't a strike, not exactly. Strikes needed power, and cowboys had none, but it was a demand, a refusal to be nothing. Amos knew the odds were against them. Hargrove could fire them, beat them, or worse, but the alternative was surrender, and Amos was too broken to give in without a fight. He spoke to Eli at dawn, his voice low as they mucked out the stable. Eli's eyes, once bright with youth, were dull, but they sparked at Amos's words. "You mean we tell Hargrove to pay up or we're done?" Eli asked, his hands tightening on the pitchfork. Amos nodded, his heart pounding. "We gotta try, Eli. Ain't no life in this otherwise." Eli hesitated, then agreed, his jaw set. They approached the new cowboys, 3 men, all as worn and desperate as Amos had been a year ago. 2, a pair named Sam and Will, agreed to join, their faces hard with resentment. The 3rd, a quiet man called Nate, shook his head. "Hargrove will kill us," he muttered, walking away. Amos didn't blame him, but he felt the loss. 4 men weren't much against a man like Hargrove. The confrontation came at noon, in the corral where the crew gathered to receive their orders. Hargrove rode up, his horse gleaming, his coat thick against the cold.
Amos stepped forward, his heart hammering, the wooden horse in his pocket, a small weight grounding him. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, his voice steady, despite the fear clawing his chest. "We need to talk about our pay. You promised us a bonus, but we ain't seen it. We're working ourselves to death for $10 a month, and it ain't enough. We want fair wages, a share of what this ranch makes." Hargrave's face twisted, his mustache quivering as he spat tobacco to the dirt. "You got some nerve, Tucker," he growled. "You think you can demand from me? You're nothing but hired hands, and you'll take what I give you." Eli stepped up beside Amos, his voice shaking but firm. We lost men for you, lost cattle, lost everything. You owe us. Sam and Will nodded, their hands near their revolvers. But Amos prayed it wouldn't come to that. He didn't want blood, just justice. Hargrave laughed, a cold, cruel sound that echoed across the corral. Owe you? I owe you nothing. You want more? Go find it somewhere else. You won't, 'cause you're all too weak to leave. He leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing. Now get back to work, or I'll have you whipped. The threat hung in the air, heavy as the storm clouds gathering overhead. Amos's anger flared, a fire that burned through his fear. We ain't your slaves, he said, his voice rising. Pay us fair, or we walk. The rancher's hand moved to the pistol at his hip, and Amos tensed, his own revolver a heavy weight against his side. The corral was silent, the other cowboys watching, Nate's eyes wide with fear. Then Hargrave smiled, a predator's grin. Walk. Then, he said, but you leave with nothing. No pay, no horse, no food. See how far you get. He spurred his horse, turning away, but Amos's desperation boiled over. We ain't leaving empty-handed, he shouted, stepping forward, his hand on his gun. The standoff exploded. Hargrave drew, his pistol flashing, but Amos was faster, his revolver barking as he fired, not at Hargrave, but at the ground, kicking up dust. Back off, Amos yelled, his voice raw. Eli, Sam, and Will drew their guns, forming a line beside him. Hargrave froze, his pistol raised, his face red with rage. You'll hang for this, he snarled, but he didn't shoot. The odds were against him, 4 guns to 1, and for the first time, Amos saw fear in the rancher's eyes. The moment stretched, taut as a wire. Amos's hand shook, his mind racing. He didn't want to kill, didn't want more blood on his hands, but he couldn't back down. Pay us what's owed, he said, his voice steady now, or we take it ourselves. Hargrave's jaw worked, his eyes darting to the bunkhouse, where his foreman and other hands were likely armed. Then, slowly, he lowered his pistol. $10 each, he said, his voice tight. That's all you get. Take it and go. It wasn't enough, not the bonus, not the fair wages they demanded, but it was something. Amos nodded, keeping his gun trained as Hargrave tossed a small sack of coins into the dirt. Eli scooped it up, counting quickly. $40, 10 for each of them. Hargrave spat again, his eyes burning. You're done here, he said. Get out, and don't come back. Amos didn't argue. He backed away, the others following, their guns still drawn until they reached the stable. They saddled the rancher's horses. Stolen, but Amos didn't care. He and Eli, Sam and Will, rode out, the coins heavy in their pockets, the plains stretching before them. Freedom tasted bitter, tinged with fear. They had money, but no plan, no home, no certainty. Cheyenne was their only hope, but what waited there? Another ranch, another Hargrave. Amos clutched the wooden horse, its edges digging into his palm. He'd made his stand, broken the chain, but the West was still a cage, its bars invisible, but iron strong. As they rode, Eli glanced at Amos, his face pale but resolute. We did it, he said, almost a question. Amos nodded, but his heart was heavy. The cowboy life had pushed him to this desperate stand, and though he'd won a small victory, the cost was steep. He was free, but to what end? The Wild West offered no answers, only more roads to nowhere, and Amos rode on, carrying the weight of a life he couldn't escape.